He was written off as just another invisible man, until the moment a gunman's finger tightened on the trigger, and the richest woman in the room realized she had mistaken a lion for a lamb. The world had a habit of looking right through Daniel Cole. He was the kind of man who could stand in a crowded room and leave no trace on anyone's memory. On the night everything changed, a torrential downpour was lashing the city, turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon. It was in this chaos that a desperate act of violence would reveal a depth of character that money could never buy, and a quiet that was anything but weak. Daniel lived in a cramped apartment above a bustling laundromat on the city's worn-down east side. It was a place where the ancient pipes groaned in complaint, and the smell of detergent was a permanent fixture. To his neighbors, he was simply the polite, soft-spoken man who shoveled snow from the sidewalks in winter without being asked, and who never failed to hold the door for anyone carrying a heavy load. He had left the military a decade prior, but you'd never know it to look at him now. He moved through life with the fluid grace of water finding its level, offering no resistance, seeking no recognition. His 11-year-old daughter, Maya, was the center of his universe. She spent most of her days with her grandmother, while Daniel worked 2 grueling jobs to afford the roof over their heads. He never breathed a word of complaint. He was simply present, a quiet pillar of reliability in a neighborhood that had long since stopped expecting much from anyone. His life was a routine of hard labor and humble moments, a deliberate choice to build a world of peace. But that peace was a fortress built on a foundation that only he knew about. On the other side of the city, in a world of glass towers and boardroom battles, lived Elena Vance. At 39, she was a titan of real estate, having built a multi-billion-dollar empire from absolutely nothing. She was a master of reading a room, of seeing the weakness in a deal and the potential in a rundown neighborhood. This particular Tuesday, she was in the East Side to personally scout a potential investment, swapping her designer labels for an unassuming gray coat in a bid to be invisible. She wanted to see the neighborhood as it truly was, not as a spreadsheet from one of her analysts described it. Through the rain-streaked window of the corner convenience store, she spotted Daniel. He was restocking a shelf with cans of vegetables, his movements deliberate and careful, as if he were handling something precious. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about him, yet the quiet precision of his actions held her gaze for a moment longer than she intended. She stepped inside under the guise of buying a bottle of water, quickly forming a dismissive impression. He seemed meek, she thought, almost painfully gentle. He handled a customer's unreasonable complaint with a patience that seemed to border on subservience. He was clearly a man who absorbed frustration to avoid conflict. It was a type she was all too familiar with, and she filed the observation away, paid for her water, and walked back out into the rain. The rain intensified as the evening wore on, turning the sky into a bruised purple. Elena had returned to the store one last time, telling herself it was to grab a coffee before heading back to her hotel. But a small, unacknowledged part of her was drawn to the strange stillness of the man behind the counter. She was near the back aisle, scrolling through property data on her phone, when the quiet hum of the store was shattered. The world collapsed inward. The screech of tires on wet asphalt was followed by the brutal slam of the front door and the sharp crack of a lock being flipped. 3 figures in dark hoodies and ski masks burst in like a wave of chaos. The tallest of them, a man with panicked eyes, leveled a handgun at the small crowd of customers. A woman near the dairy case let out a scream that was quickly stifled. An elderly man dropped to his knees, his groceries scattering. The air itself seemed to grow thick with terror. "Get down! Everybody on the floor now!" The lead gunman bellowed, his voice cracking with a youthful, adrenaline-fueled desperation. The customers scrambled to obey, sinking to the dirty tile floor, weeping and frozen with fear. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she crouched low behind a shelf of soup cans, her phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip, terrified to move. In the chaos, her eyes frantically searched for the meek store clerk, and what she saw made her breath catch. He was still standing. Daniel stood exactly where he had been behind the counter, his hands slowly lowering but not raised in surrender. He didn't drop. He didn't beg. He just stood there impossibly still, his expression a mask of absolute, unnerving calm. His breathing was visibly slow and measured. Alina's mind raced. He's frozen, she thought, a wave of pity and fear washing over her. He's completely paralyzed with terror. The gunman's attention whipped toward the standing man. "I said get down!" He barked, the muzzle of his weapon trembling as it pointed at Daniel's chest. Alina, peering from behind the cans, felt a strange mixture of horror and disbelief. She watched him for any sign of the fear she felt, but all she saw was an almost meditative stillness. It was the only explanation that made sense: psychological shutdown. But what Alina couldn't see was the storm of clarity raging behind Daniel's calm eyes. This was not a man frozen by fear. It was a man who had just been pulled from the warm embrace of peace and plunged back into the freezing waters of war. His mind was not racing. It was a high-powered computer running a threat assessment program he had spent a lifetime perfecting. He noted the gunman's stance, too wide for a trained shooter. He registered the slight tremor in the man's hand, the way his finger sat outside the trigger guard, a rookie's mistake. He cataloged the room, the location of the other two gunmen, the positions of the hostages, the exit routes, the angle of the security camera. He could hear the lead gunman's breathing, quick and shallow, the signature sound of panic, not calculated menace. This young man was not a hardened criminal. He was a terrified kid who had made a terrible choice and was now in way over his head. Deep within Daniel's chest, an old and familiar quiet settled over him. It was the same quiet that had kept him alive in places infinitely more dangerous than this humble convenience store. Beneath the surface stillness that Alina mistook for fear, a plan was forming with surgical precision. The seconds felt like hours. The only sounds were muffled sobs and the relentless drumming of rain against the window. Daniel made no sudden moves. He was like a chess master, waiting for his opponent to commit. A teenage boy near the back let out a tiny whimper, drawing the second gunman's angry focus. The tension in the room became a razor's edge, the kind of volatile energy that could tip into violence with a single errant movement. Alina was certain they were all about to die. And then in that exact moment, Daniel finally spoke. His voice was low, even, and startlingly calm. "Trevor." The single word landed like a grenade in the silent room. The lead gunman went rigid, his shoulders snapping back as if he'd been struck. For the first time, genuine confusion replaced the manic edge in his eyes. Alina, still crouched behind the shelf, felt a cold chill of realization. Daniel wasn't frozen. He'd been watching and waiting, and somehow, impossibly, he knew this man's name. "How the hell do you know my name?" Trevor demanded, his voice cracking with fear. The gun in his hand wavered dangerously. Daniel didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly towards the man's forearm where the sleeve of his hoodie had ridden up, revealing the edge of a faded, distinct tattoo. 82nd Airborne, Daniel said quietly, his tone holding no judgment, only recognition. "I served with men who had that ink. You don't get that from a street corner tattoo parlor. You earned that." The room held its breath. The other two gunmen exchanged uncertain glances as their leader's confidence visibly crumbled. Trevor's free hand moved instinctively to cover the tattoo, a gesture that only confirmed Daniel's deduction. Alina found herself leaning forward, her survival instinct suddenly battling an overwhelming need to understand what was happening. "You were infantry, probably Tutor," Daniel continued, his voice never rising above a conversational register. "You got out within the last year or so. A seasoned soldier doesn't hold a weapon the way you're holding that one. You came home to an empty life, didn't you? Nothing waiting for you but memories and a GI Bill that doesn't fix the quiet pain inside. This isn't who you are, Trevor. You're a soldier, not a criminal." Trevor's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Alina feared the words had pushed him too far. But then something in the young man's posture sagged, the rigid aggression softening into a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered, his voice hollow. "I know you've never killed anyone," Daniel said, his eyes steady on Trevor's. I know because you're holding that gun like you're afraid of it. Your finger is outside the trigger guard. You're scared, Trevor. And scared men make decisions they can't take back. Decisions that follow them for the rest of their lives, longer than any prison sentence ever could. Alina was transfixed. This was not a man frozen in terror. This was a man systematically dismantling a crisis with nothing but words. He was reading details invisible to everyone else and using them with the precision of a master surgeon. She thought of every high-stakes negotiation she had ever conducted, and with a humbling shock, she realized she was witnessing something far beyond her own expertise. How do you know all this? Trevor pleaded, his voice quieter now, stripped of all aggression. Daniel held the young man's gaze, his steadiness anchoring the entire chaotic room. Because I used to be exactly where you are, he said, his voice softening to something almost gentle. Not robbing a store, but standing somewhere I never thought I'd be, wondering how it all went so wrong. The difference between you and the man I was is that someone talked me back from that edge. I'm trying to do the same for you, Trevor. That's all this is. Trevor's hand trembled violently, the gun dipping lower. Alina saw the young man's eyes well with tears, his composure crumbling. The other two gunmen shifted uneasily, their roles in the robbery destabilized by a hostage who refused to act like one. It was in this fragile, suspended moment that the second gunman, growing increasingly agitated, made a sudden panic decision. "We need to go. This is taking too long," he hissed, swinging his own weapon wildly. In his desperation, the muzzle of his gun drifted dangerously close to Trevor's back, an accidental threat that no one else in the room registered. But Daniel caught it instantly. His trained eyes flicked from Trevor's trembling hand to the second man's rigid stance. This was no longer a robbery. It was a fracture forming between two armed, desperate men, one of whom had just decided the other was a liability. Daniel's pulse, which had remained steady, quickened only slightly. Not from fear, but from the sharp recalibration required to address a threat that had just multiplied in complexity. There was no time for careful words. "Trevor, down!" Daniel shouted, his voice cutting through the tension with a force that startled everyone in the room. Trevor flinched and dropped low just as Daniel lunged forward over the counter. The crack of gunfire split the air. The bullet meant for Trevor's back tore harmlessly into a display of chips. Several customers screamed, raw and primal. Alina pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle her own cry. And then, in the next heartbeat, the heavy front door of the store burst inward. The lock Trevor had flipped earlier proved no match for the SWAT team that had been quietly positioning itself outside for the better part of 20 minutes. Ever since Officer Ramirez had noticed something strange, a series of deliberate, patterned flashes from the store's front window. It was Morse code, tapped out using nothing more than the angle of a metal napkin dispenser catching the streetlight. Daniel had spotted the police vehicles arriving silently down the block a quarter of an hour ago. Recognizing the careful choreography of their positioning, he had used the reflected light to relay his assessment of the situation. The number of assailants, their positions, their emotional states, and his specific request that they hold their approach. He had trusted himself to manage the volatile internal dynamics from within, rather than risk a chaotic breach that could result in casualties. Officer Ramirez, recognizing the skill in the signal, had made the difficult decision to trust a stranger's judgment over standard protocol. The SWAT team flowed into the store with practiced precision. The second gunman was tackled and disarmed within seconds. The third man surrendered immediately, dropping to his knees with his hands in the air. Trevor remained crumpled on the floor where Daniel had pushed him, his weapon clattering from his grip. He was no longer the aggressor, just a frightened young man, tears streaming down his face as the adrenaline finally abandoned him. Daniel knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. "This isn't the end of your story," he said softly, his words too quiet for anyone else to hear clearly. "You'll carry this, but you don't have to let it define you. Get help, real help. You deserve that chance." Trevor nodded weakly as officers gently pulled him to his feet. Alina remained rooted near the back aisle. Her mind, struggling to reconcile the man she had dismissively assumed, was frozen in fear with the figure who had just orchestrated the de-escalation of an armed robbery using nothing but words, patience, and an almost supernatural read on human behavior. As officers led the three young men out into the rain-soaked night, Daniel remained behind, speaking quietly with Officer Ramirez. "That signal you sent us," Ramirez said, shaking his head. "That's not something civilians know how to do. Where did you learn that?" Daniel offered a brief, modest explanation, mentioning his years of military service without elaborating. It was only later, once officers began taking statements, that the full picture emerged. One officer, scrolling through a tablet, murmured to a colleague, "Daniel Cole, former Marine, but look here." He spent his last few years attached to a classified crisis negotiation unit. Another officer let out a low whistle. Daniel stood quietly near the entrance, waiting to give his own statement like any ordinary witness, rather than the man who had just single-handedly diffused a hostage situation. Alina felt something shift inside her chest. The man she had so casually dismissed as simply gentle, timid, was in fact a master of high-stakes human calculus. She felt an unfamiliar heat of embarrassment, which was quickly overtaken by a profound sense of admiration. She approached him cautiously, her voice quiet. "I thought you were frozen. When it started, I thought you were too scared to move." Daniel looked at her, his expression neither defensive nor proud. "Most people would have thought the same thing," he said. "Stillness looks like fear if you don't know what you're looking for. But sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room isn't the person holding the gun. It's the panic itself. Someone has to hold on to clarity, even when it doesn't look like much from the outside." In the days that followed, Alina couldn't set aside what she had witnessed. The memory of Daniel's calm voice kept returning to her. She began making discreet inquiries, and what she discovered painted a portrait of a man who had walked away from a brilliant, classified career. He had been decorated multiple times for actions that remained redacted. He had turned down lucrative offers from private security firms, offers that would have provided him immense financial security. He had chosen a life of deliberate simplicity to be present for his daughter. The strongest walls are built with silence, not steel. Real courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph of wisdom over panic. She reached out to him 2 weeks later, requesting a meeting. He agreed. They met at a small coffee shop near his apartment, rain once again tapping against the window. "I want to offer you something," she said. "I'm restructuring the security operations for my entire company. I've never seen anyone handle a crisis the way you did. I'd like you to be our director of security. The compensation would be substantial." Daniel listened, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that," he said finally, "but I don't want that life anymore. I spent years in rooms where the stakes were measured in human lives. I walked away because I needed to be present for my daughter. I need to build something quieter." "Then what do you want?" she asked, genuinely curious. Daniel considered the question. "I want a place where people are valued for who they are," he said. "Not overlooked because they don't have an impressive title. I've spent my life around people who carry enormous weight quietly without recognition. If you want to do something meaningful, build something that honors that. Don't just hire me to manage threats." His words landed with a weight that Alina felt deep in her chest. "You're right," she admitted. "I've spent my entire career building wealth without really considering what it costs the people who make it possible. I needed to hear that." In the months that followed, Alina used her immense resources to build a training center. It was an institute designed to teach crisis management and de-escalation skills to social workers, teachers, and community organizers. Daniel agreed to serve as its lead instructor, not for a massive salary, but because the work finally allowed him to use his skills in a way that aligned with the quiet life he had built. At the opening ceremony, Alina spoke to the gathered crowd. "I walked into that store thinking I understood courage," she said. "I thought it meant raising your voice. I learned that night that real courage often looks like stillness, like patience, like someone choosing wisdom over panic." Daniel stood near the back, his expression modest. When Alina gestured for him to join her, he stepped forward reluctantly. "I'm just an ordinary man," he said simply. I didn't do anything that night that any of you couldn't learn to do. Given the right training and the willingness to stay calm when everything is telling you to panic. That's what this place is for. Elena smiled and addressed the crowd once more. He keeps insisting he's ordinary, she said warmly. But I've come to understand that what's truly extraordinary is the deliberate choice to remain calm when chaos would be easier. To think of others before yourself, when fear would justify almost any reaction. To walk toward danger, not because you're fearless, but because you've decided that protecting others matters more than protecting yourself. A quiet man in a crisis is a fortress in a storm. True courage is choosing wisdom when everyone else chooses panic. They stood together near the center's entrance as the ceremony concluded, watching the first group of trainees tour the facility. Thank you, Elena said, for showing me something about value that I'd managed to miss. You reminded me that the most important things rarely announce themselves loudly. Daniel turned to her, his expression open and warm. And you reminded me that the people with the most power are sometimes the ones most willing to actually listen, to change course when they realize they've been moving in the wrong direction. There was no dramatic gesture. Just a handshake, warm and genuine, followed by a shared look of unmistakable mutual respect. They stood together for a moment, ready to begin whatever came next. The rain had long since stopped, replaced by the ordinary rhythm of daily life. And in that rhythm, the quiet legacy of that night in the convenience store would continue to ripple outward. Because that night, a millionaire didn't just see a quiet man stay calm during a robbery. She saw a reflection of her own untapped potential for grace under pressure, a lesson you can't put a price tag on. The single dad who never raised his voice had just rewritten the definition of strength for everyone in that room. So I have to ask you a question. What would you do if everything you thought you knew about courage was tested in a single blinding moment? Would you be loud or would you be still? Comment below. And if this story changed the way you see strength, hit that like button for my channel. Subscribe for more stories that challenge what you think you know about the human spirit.